So hello, my name is Dr Tolullah Oni. I'm a public health physician and an urban epidemiologist.
Dr. Oni, thank you for joining me. So my name is Alana Francis, I'm from the Voice newspaper, and we've got some questions from our readers, mostly around the safety of the COVID-19 vaccine. So the first one is around the content. So a full list of ingredients of the Pfizer vaccine has not yet been released, and our readers are concerned about how they can trust and make an informed decision without knowing all the ingredients. I wondered if you could answer that, and is that something that's common when it comes to vaccines not releasing the full list?
Yeah. So I think it's important to, in answering that question, contextualize it in the realities of where we are now. So we're in the middle of a pandemic that we know has had significant impacts on and consequences on people's lives, both from a health and economic and social perspectives. So, and also as a result, dealing with huge amounts of mistrust in government, mistrust in science, etc. It's not unusual to not have the detailed ingredients of all of what is in a vaccine. The key things that are normally set out are whether or not, for example, it contains any key allergenic components, like if it has any egg components, because obviously that would be relevant to people with egg allergies, or whether it has whether it's a live vaccine, because that has implications on people with compromised immune systems. So for example, with the COVID vaccine, we do know that there's a warning around those who suffer from severe allergic reactions should not be receiving it, and that's because people were excluded from the trial. So that kind of information is usually readily available.
Thank you. So again, with safety, one of the concerns has been around the speed of the vaccine, which we know a lot of that has been, the response to that has been that, there's been a lot of funds directed to this, also people who have come forward to be part of the trials. But a reoccurring question from our readers is, can I trust the vaccine? Especially, I think, in terms of the mid to long-term effects. So one reader's asking about the side effects that might arise in 2 or 5 or 10 years' time. How can it be safe to distribute a vaccine when we don't know about those possible side effects?
Mm-hmm. So again, I think with every question, it's important to consider the why. So why is this an important question on people's minds? One aspect, of course, is the speed at which it's been developed. The other, of course, is the historical precedents around that result in mistrust. So the history of untested medicines and products in people, in Black and brown people. So it's an understandable question to ask, because that's the first thing, and because that's important to recognize where that comes from. The second is that we are facing, this is such an unprecedented event that it is, even for scientists, I think even the most optimistic was surprised. So I thought, we know how long it normally takes, but it has had a lot thrown at it, right? So there's been, and for obvious reasons, the urgency of needing a biomedical way out and a vaccine across the world, it has has driven the pace of it. So I personally, as a scientist, I trust that process, because I know that it is conducted rigorously, even and the regulatory process of assessing its safety and its efficacy it's a very rigorous process. It's you know, we haven't had anything like this really in our living memory, where basically all resources have been put into it. So that's essentially what happens. It's quite exciting for me scientifically, because you realize what advances are possible when we set our minds to it. And tangentially makes me think about the other conditions that we haven't prioritized because they largely affect poor people. You know, I worked in tuberculosis for a long time, and we haven't had a good, we're still using BCG, which is an ancient vaccine, which is effective in babies and preventing severe tuberculosis, but not in adulthood. And there've been several trials and not really, and I think, wow, if we dedicated our minds to addressing such a scourge, and not just because it doesn't affect us all does not make it okay for it to still be around. It's phenomenal, I think, what we would be able to do. So my take home from it really is the need for more science advocacy for those conditions, and for everyone, for all of us to say, well, okay, well, globally, these conditions, it's a scandal that in the 21st century, we're okay with these conditions still being around, because we have the science, we have the resources to get rid of them.
Would you take the vaccine?
Absolutely. There's really no question about it. It's really critical. I think I'm in my age group, I'm at the bottom on the bottom of the list. I only have 4 decades on me, and I'm not a frontline worker. So obviously that's a privilege, in that my exposure, my risk of severe disease is low. So I will wait my turn, but I will very readily take it.
One of the concerns around safety has been around the government's granting of a legal indemnity protecting Pfizer from any legal action that might arise as a result of any potential problems with the vaccine in future. That has caused one of our readers to ask, is it safe if they're, being protected from possible future legal action?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question, and I plead the fifth in not knowing anything about the legal side of things. I couldn't tell you how normal or abnormal that is. So I really can't comment on that. What I can say is that, we are in a situation where, what is normal with a new vaccine is that, or I should say, the vaccines that have been around for a while, we have accrued time. So we've got into the phase 4 of the vaccines, which is when it's marketed and we have active surveillance going on to see what additional side effects crop up, which you can only see with A, mass vaccination, and B, time. So it's a really it's a difficult toss-up, because on one hand you want to people concerned about safety for the reasons we talked about earlier. On the other hand, we don't have the benefit of the time that would have passed to observe. And with anything around safety, nothing is 100% safe. Our lives, we don't go to the shops 100% safely, and I mean that pre-COVID. So it's important that we're thinking about this in terms of risks and relative risks, right? So in the context of a global pandemic, where that is really, especially where we are now with community transmission, you have to consider the risk of having the disease still in transmission in the community versus the risk of taking a vaccine. So whilst there are no certainties about what happens 3 years after the vaccine, because it's not been around for 3 years, we know that what's happening now is that if a good percentage of the population doesn't get immune, we will continue with these cycles of lockdown and death and disproportional widening of health inequalities, and also socioeconomic inequalities. So because we see that COVID is not affecting people equally. So that is the toss-up, and my concern with the vaccine is that the very people who have a right to be concerned about safety for historical and, to be honest, contemporary systemic discriminatory reasons are the same groups of people who are at greater risk of exposure and death from the disease. So it really is, you know, it's really worrying. So it highlights the importance of having these conversations, of going beyond just, oh, trust us, it's safe, to really engaging and listening to people and understanding, well, not just dismissing your questions as, oh, you know, just trust us, but understanding where people come from, understanding why they're asking, and taking the time to address those concerns. Because otherwise you get this sense, you get an even further widening of this inequalities, which you want to avoid, where the vaccine coverage is also ends up being unequal, with lower coverage in Black and minority ethnic groups, which would be such a tragedy.
You've mentioned there the health inequalities that have been, you know, put under the spotlight by the pandemic, and also the government has been urged to do more to address these existing health inequalities, which we know disproportionately affect Black and minority ethnic communities, as has the COVID-19 outbreak. But there is a lot of dissatisfaction, frustration, anger over the seemingly lack of action that the government has taken to address those concerns. And obviously this push for people to take the vaccine, we know that around the trials there was a call for, you know, Black people to come forward because of low representation. How does that impact on the efficacy and safety of the vaccine if there aren't a high enough amount of Black people represented in the trials?
Yeah. So I think, it's a really important question, and worldwide, beyond COVID, it's a huge issue, because we see inequality in terms of participation in research in Black and brown people. So I don't have the numbers, because those haven't been released, except to say that the information that has been released is that the efficacy that has been shown is consistent across different ethnic groups. So that implies that there were different ethnic groups that were involved in the trial. I couldn't tell you details of what proportion of those were, but I thought it was certainly assuring that that particular aspect of the result was disaggregated and mentioned, that not just across different age groups, but also in different ethnicities. But you raise an important point of the need for greater participation, but it's beyond just saying people need to. Well, you know, you have to build that trust, right? In order to engage aspects of community equally in research. So I can't overemphasize enough the importance of that trust building, not just in the moments of crisis, because it's very difficult to build trust from scratch in the middle of a crisis. But consistently listening and involving different communities in decisions made around health and healthcare, because we've seen that all throughout the pandemic, from access and understanding of information related to what should and shouldn't be done around seeking healthcare, around, you know, every single step we've seen that the interventions could have benefited from participation in those communities to understand how best to reach those communities, rather than just waiting until the end to say, well, people are not participating or people are not coming. It's like, well, there is a broader societal context that you have to engage with. And then beyond the epidemic, you have to think about how to sustain that. So one of the things I'm really passionate about beyond just treatment is prevention and reducing vulnerability, right? Because we talked about this a little bit along the way of the pandemic, but obviously with the vaccines, that's been talked about less, but we've talked about obesity, increasing the risk of severe COVID and poor outcomes. We know that chronic exposure to air pollution worsens outcomes from COVID and others. And we know that those conditions are not equally distributed again across society. So we know that, so what are we doing in the long term? And I think it's as important now to have the conversations around the participation in getting people and improving vaccine uptake as it is to say, okay, the next time we have a pandemic or the next time we have an epidemic of any sort, how do we ensure that they're not groups of the population that are disproportionately vulnerable? And that work starts now as well. And that's a health justice issue, to say, well, we can't have it's not okay to be in a country where we report, we can say, oh, overall our air pollution is okay, but actually when you look at a neighborhood level, the places where you have disproportionately minority and Black ethnic groups, you have poor air. I mean, that's not okay. So we need to be doing something, thinking long term now. Because we can't afford to wait until, okay, after we're done with this. So that never comes, because there's always another issue. So whilst we're saying now, how do we reduce the risk of COVID by increasing vaccine uptake? Also, how do we, also in the short term, how do we ensure people are not disproportionately exposed to it at work, or adequately protected? And then in the longer term, how do we ensure that we address and we tackle those underlying vulnerabilities that are disproportionately affecting some people based on their access to good quality housing, to good clean air, and to safe jobs? So those for me are as urgent and critical, because otherwise we're just waiting for the balance to tip for in another event to have the same conversations, which is infuriating.
Younger people who don't have any, who aren't particularly vulnerable, will be lower down the list of priority and access. What can people who are not taking the vaccine right now do to protect themselves?
I think I'll answer that as sort of globally, because even for, I would say, for everybody, right? So we're not exactly sure what the level of population-wide immunity would be required to interrupt transmission. So, and that's because that takes time to, so for example, we know for measles, it needs to be over 90% in order to interrupt transmission. And so when it gets below that, we worry about outbreaks. So we're not sure what that is, right? And so I would say with this advice applies to really everybody. It's not separating society. I would say that essentially until we have that sufficient coverage, it's really critical that we continue those non-pharmaceutical interventions, the things that we know work, right? So we know transmission is largely through aerosol and through droplets and through surface. So increasing as much as possible, avoiding crowded spaces indoors, washing hands, not touching your face, wearing a mask in indoors and in enclosed or in crowded spaces, even outdoors, restricting the number of interactions that so it's all the things that we already know, mm-hmm. right? the it's just we just have to, we're at the point where we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? So we have a vaccines and several vaccines that are coming behind that will slowly get us there. It's really not that long to go, and psychologically, I think anyway, personally, it's a lot easier to deal with than, okay, this is another 3 months. We don't know when it's going to, you know, there's nothing at the end of the tunnel. This we can see, you know, we've gone through this for almost a year. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's just not that much additional. So I would say just really encourage everyone to continue to apply those control measures that we know work, around using a mask, around washing your hands or cleaning your hands, and avoiding crowded spaces, both indoors and out. And I hope that increasingly with time, we have the questions and the uncertainties that people have around the vaccines answered, and we have increasing uptake.
Based on the what you talked about is the historic distrust, someone has said that they're not convinced that everyone will get the same vaccine. So I think they're particularly talking about in terms of this Pfizer one that's being rolled out.
My response to it would be to address that distrust, right? And doing that involves, requires transparency and requires conversation. So these kinds of campaigns, and this is an unprecedented campaign of this scale, certainly in this country, can't be top down, right? So this person asking that, we would need their kind of community leaders and people that they trust engaged to understand, and they would be the voices that ask the questions that people want to know. So it would be helpful would it be helpful for you to understand the logistically how areas are prioritized, who will be distributing the vaccine, for example. You know, we know, you know, GPs are trusted spaces. You're more likely to go to your GP for a vaccine, especially a new vaccine, than, you know, a military point, you know, where you don't know. So it's really important that the ways that the vaccination campaign is rolled out and implemented speaks to those lived experiences of people and addresses up front. And I've been saying this before the vaccines were ready, because when there was the conversations around the trials and people were talking, I was saying back then, we don't know when the trials will end and the vaccines will be approved, but the work needs to start now to understand where people are at, to understand what information people would find helpful and would be reassured by. That work of building trust and listening and being guided by the lived experiences needed to have started before the vaccinations were being rolled out. But it's not too late. Obviously, it's really critical that that identifying, well, who are they religious leaders? Are they, you know, civil society leaders or local public health leaders and GPs? Who would be the key people? And they might differ in different communities in different parts of the country. Who would be the key people that we need to engage? Who would be the people that would understand, if, you know, that you could ask to say, you know, have an ear on the ground to say, okay, these are the kinds of questions that people have. It's not okay to not be clear, to not be clear about some of these issues. Some communities might want to know exactly, you know, who is going to be giving it, where has it come from, etc., and all of that. So I don't have a direct answer to that question, except to answer, I think, where it comes from and the importance of tailoring the implementation strategy to the lived experiences and concerns of people.
And then we have a question about, I guess this is more general in terms of vaccines, but why is it that having the virus only gives someone immunity for possibly a few months, but vaccinations can give up to a lifetime of immunity?
Mm-hmm. Well, on both accounts, we don't know how long. So we don't know how long immunity lasts with people who have been sick. We don't know how long yet immunity lasts in the vaccinated. But the reasons why with other vaccines relates to the immune system, right? So there are different parts of the immune system that are activated when you are naturally exposed to the disease or whether you are vaccinated. And the reason why, and not all vaccines are lifelong, by the way. We know that some vaccines, yellow fever, we say every 10 years, and that's actually quite a long one. But we know that, and the reason why is that in the design and how vaccines are developed, they try to identify, the vaccine has a one up on the body, if you like, because with the exposure to the disease, the body has not seen it before, so it just does what it naturally does. Whereas when we understand how the body reacts to the virus, we can design vaccines that trigger more long-lasting immune functions, so we can make the body produce the immune cells that cause more lasting immunity. So that's the added advantage of a vaccine, because vaccine is like hindsight, right? We can see what happens, and then we can tailor our prevention strategy to supercharge what her body does naturally.